Okay, hi everyone, welcome back to this video series on Server 2012, creating and managing DHCP scopes. You can use any number of DHCP servers on a single physical network if you divide the range of addresses that you want assigned into multiple scopes. Each scope contains a number of useful pieces of data, but before you can understand them, you need to know some additional terminology. You can perform the following management tasks on DHCP scopes: create a scope, configure scope properties, configure reservations and exclusions, set scope options, activate and deactivate scopes, create a super scope, create a multicast scope, integrate dynamic DNS and DHCP. Creating a new scope in IPv4. Like many other things in Windows Server 2012 R2, a wizard drives the process of creating a new scope. You will most likely create a scope while installing DHCP, but you may need to create more than one. The overall process is simple. As long as you know beforehand what the wizard is going to ask, if you think about what defines a scope, you will be well prepared. You need to know the following: the IP address range of the scope you want to create, which IP addresses, if any, you want to exclude from the address pool, which IP addresses, if any, you want to reserve, values for the DHCP options you want to set, if any. This item isn't strictly necessary for creating a scope. However, to create a useful scope, you'll need to have some options to specify for the clients. To create a scope under the server name, right-click the IPv4 option in the DHCP snap-in and use the action New Scope command. This starts the new scope wizard. See figure 218. You will look at each page of the wizard in the following sections. Setting the screen name. The scope name page allows you to enter a name and description for your scope. These will be displayed by the DHCP snap-in. Defining the IP address range. The IP address range, see figure 219, is where you enter the start and end IP address of your range. The wizard does minimal checking on the addresses you enter, and it automatically calculates the appropriate subnet mask for the range. You can modify the subnet mask if you know what you're doing. Adding exclusions and delay. The Add Exclusions and Delay page allows you to create exclusion ranges. Exclusions are TCP IP numbers that are in the pool, but they do not get issued to clients. To exclude one address, put it in the Start IP address field. To exclude a range, also fill in the End IP address field. The delay setting is a time duration by which the server will delay the transmission of a DHCP offer message. Setting the lease option. Setting a lease duration, The lease duration, see figure 221, allows you to set how long a device gets to use an assigned IP address before it has to renew its lease. The default lease option is 8 days. You may find that a shorter or longer duration makes sense for your network. If your network is highly dynamic with lots of arrivals, departures, and moving computers, set a shorter lease duration. If it's less active, make it longer. Configuring basic DHCP options. The Configure DHCP option page allows you to choose whether you want to set up basic DHCP options such as the default gateway and DNS settings. The options are described in the following sections. If you choose not to configure options, you can always do so later. However, you should not activate the scope until you've configured the options you want assigned. Configuring a router. The first option configuration is the router default gateway page in which you enter the IP address of one or more routers, more commonly referred to as default gateways, that you want to use for outbound traffic. After entering the IP addresses of the routers, use the up and down buttons in order. It's our buttons to order the addresses. Clients will use routers in the order specified when attempting to send outgoing packets. Providing DNS settings on the domain name and DNS servers page, you can specify the set of DNS servers and the parent domain you want to pass down to DHCP clients. Normally, you'll want to specify at least one DNS server by filling in its DNS name or IP address. You can also specify the domain suffix that you want clients to use at the base domain for all connections that aren't fully qualified. For example, if your clients are used for navigating based on a server name alone rather than the fully qualified domain name FUDN of server.willpanic.com, then you'll want to place your domain here. Figure 2.3 router default gateway page of the new scope wizard. Figure 2.4 domain name and DNS servers page of the new scope wizard. Providing WINS settings. If you're still using Windows Internet Name Services, WINS, on your network, you can configure DHCP so that it passes WINS server addresses to your Windows clients. If you want the Windows client to honor it, you will also need to define the WINS NBT node type options for the scope, as on the DNS server page. On the WINS server page, see figure 2.25, you can enter the addresses of several servers and move them into the order in which you want clients to try them. You can enter DNS or net bias name of each server, or you can enter an IP address. Figure 2.25, WINS servers page of the new scope wizard. Here are some of the most common options to set on a DHCP server. 003 router used to provide a list of available routers or default gateways on the same subnet. 006 DNS servers used to provide a list of DNS servers. 015 DNS domain name used to provide the DNS suffix. 028 broadcast address used to configure the broadcast address if different than the default based on the subnet mask. 44 WINS NBNS servers used to configure the IP addresses of WINS servers. 46 WNBS node type used to configure net bias name resolution. H node 0x8 hypernode does a P node and then a B node. 051 lease used to configure a special lease duration. Activating the scope. The Activate Scope page gives you the option to activate the scope immediately after creating it. By default, the wizard assumes that you want the scope activated unless you select the No, I will activate the scope later radio button, in which case the scope will remain dormant until you activate it manually. Figure 2.26, activate scope page of the new scope wizard. Creating a new scope. Open the DHCP snap-in by selecting Administrative Tools, DHCP. Right-click the IPv4 folder and choose New Scope. The new scope wizard appears. Click the Next button on the welcome page. Enter a name and a description for your new scope. Click the Next button. On the IP address range, enter range page, enter 192.168.0.2 and the start IP address for the scope and 192.168.0.250 as the end IP address. Leave the subnet mask controls alone. Though when creating a scope on a production network, you might need to change them. Click the Next buttons on the Add Exclusions and Delay page. Click Next without adding any excluded addresses or delays. On the lease duration page, set the lease duration to 3 days. Click the Next button. On the Configure DHCP options page, click the Next button to indicate you want to configure default options for the scope. On the router default gateway page, enter 192.168.0.1 for the router IP address and then click the Add button. Once the address is added, click the Next button. On the domain name and DNS servers page, enter the IP address of a DNS server on your network in the IP address field. For example, you might enter 192.168.0.251 and click the Add button. Click the Next button. On the Wins server page, click the Next button to leave the Wins option unset. On the Activate Scope page, if your network is currently using the 192.168.0.x range, select Yes, I want to activate this scope now. Click the Next button. When the wizard summary page appears, click the Finish button to create the scope, creating a new scope in IPv6. Now that you have seen how to create a new scope in IPv4, I'll go through the steps to create a new scope in IPv6. To create a scope, right-click the IPv6 option in the DHCP snap-in under the server name and select the action New Scope command. This starts the new scope wizard, just as with creating a scope in IPv4. The welcome page of the wizard tells you that you've launched the new scope wizard. You will look at each page of the wizard in the following sections: setting, the screen name. The scope name page allows you to enter a name and description for your scope. These will be displayed by the DHCP snap-in. Scope prefix. The scope prefix page gets you started creating the IPv6 scope. IPv6 has 3 types of addresses, which can be categorized by type and scope. Figure 2.8 scope prefix page of the new scope wizard. Following addresses 1 to 1. A packet for one host is delivered to another host. The following are some examples of IPv6 unicast. The unicast prefix for site local addresses is FEC0:48. The unicast prefix for the local link address is FE80:/64. The 624 address allows communication between 2 hosts running both IPv4 and IPv6. The way to calculate the 624 address is by combining the global prefix 2002:/16 with the 32 bits of a public IPv4 address of the host. This gives you a 48-bit prefix. 624 is described in RFC 3056 multicast addresses. One-to-many. A packet from one host is delivered to multiple hosts. The prefix for multicast address is FF00::8. Anycast address. A packet from one host is delivered to the nearest of multiple hosts. Address exclusions. As with IPv4 new scope wizard the add exclusion page allows you to create exclusion ranges. Exclusions are TCP IP numbers that are in the pool but do not get issued to clients. To exclude one address, put it in the start IPv6 address field. To exclude a range, also fill in the end IPv6 address field. Figure 229, add exclusions page of the new scope wizard. Setting a lease duration. The scope Lease page allows you to set how long a device gets to use an assigned IP address before it has to renew its lease. You can set two different lease durations. The section labeled non-temporary address IANA is the lease time for your more permanent hosts, such as printers and server towers. The one labeled temporary address IATA is for hosts that might disconnect at any time, such as laptops. Activating the scope, completing the new scope wizard page gives you the option to activate the scope immediately after creating it. By default, the wizard will assume you want the scope activated. If you want to wait to activate the scope, choose No in the Activate Scope Now box, changing scope properties IPv4 and IPv6. Each scope has a set of properties associated with it, except for the set of options assigned by the scope. You can find these properties on the General tab of the Scope's Properties. Figure 230, Scope Lease page of the new Scope Wizard. Figure 231, completing the new Scope Wizard page of the new Scope Wizard. Figure 232, General tab of the Scope's Properties dialog box for an IPv4 scope. The start IP address and end address fields allows you to set the range of the scope. For IPv4 scopes, the settings in the section Lease Duration for DHCP clients control how long leases in the scope are valid. Changing server properties. Just as each scope has its own set of properties, so too does the server itself. You can access the server properties by right-clicking the IPv4 or IPv6 object within the DHCP management console and selecting properties. IPv4 server properties. Figure 233 shows the IPv4 properties dialog box. Figure 233, General tab, the IPv4 properties dialog box for the server. The IPv4 properties dialog box has 4 tabs: General, DNS, Network Access Protection, and Advanced. The Advanced tab shown in figure 234 contains the following configuration parameters. Audit log file path is where you enter the location for log files. Conflict detection attempt specifies how many ICMP echo request pings the server sends for an address is about to offer. The default is 0. Conflict detection is a way to verify that the DHCP server is not issuing IP addresses that are already being used on the network. The Network Access Protection tab, see figure 235, allows you to set up Network Access Protection NAP with NAP, which is a Server 2012 R2 service. An administrator can perform the following tasks: carry out computer health policy validation, ensure ongoing compliance with health policies, optionally restrict the access of computers that do not meet the computer health requirements. Figure 234, the Advanced tab of the IPv4 properties dialog box of the server. 235, the Network Access Protection tab of the IPv4 properties dialog box for the server. IPv6 server properties. The IPv6 properties dialog box for the server has 2 tabs, General and Advanced. On the General tab, you can configure the following settings: frequency with which statistics are updated, DHCP auditing. The Advanced tab allows you to configure the following settings: database path for the audit log file path, connections binding, registration credentials for dynamic DNS. The registration credential is the user account that DHCP will use to register clients with Active Directory, managing reservations and exclusions. After defining the address pool for your scope. The next step is to create reservations and exclusions, which reduce the size of the pool. In the following sections, you will learn how to add and remove exclusions and reservations. Figure 237, Servers IPv6 Properties Advanced tab, adding and removing exclusions. When you want to exclude an entire range of IP addresses, you need to add that range as an exclusion. Ordinarily, you'll want to do this before you enable a scope because that prevents any type of IP addresses you want excluded from being leased before you have any chance to exclude them. In fact, you can't create an exclusion that's included a leased address. You have to get rid of the lease first. Adding an exclusion range. Here's how to add an exclusion range. Open the DHCP snap-in and find the scope to which you want to add an exclusion, either IPv4 or IPv6. Expand the scope so that you can see its address pool item for IPv4 or the exclusion section for IPv6. Right-click the address pool or exclusion section and choose the new exclusion range command. When the add exclusion dialog box appears, see figure 238, enter the IP address you want to exclude. To exclude a single address, type in the start IP address field. To exclude a range of addresses, also fill in the end IP address field. Click the add button to add the exclusion. When you add exclusions, they appear in the address pool, which is under the scope section for IPv4 and under the exclusion section of IPv6. Removing an exclusion range. To remove an exclusion, just right-click it and choose the delete command. After confirming your command, the snap-in removes an excluded range and the address becomes immediately available for issuance. Adding and removing reservations. Adding a reservation is simple as long as you have the MAC address of the device for which you want to create a reservation. Because reservations belong to a single scope, you create and remove them within the reservations node beneath each scope. Adding a reservation. To add a reservation, perform the following tasks. Right-click the scope and select New Reservation. This displays the new reservation dialog box shown in figure 239. Enter the IP address and the MAC address or ID for the reservation. If you want, you can also enter a name and description. For IPv4 in the supported type section, choose whether the reservation will be made by DHCP only or BOOTP only, useful for remote access devices or both. Removing a reservation. To remove a reservation, right-click it and select delete. This removes the reservation but does nothing to the client device. Setting scope options for IPv4. Once you've installed a server, authorize it in Active Directory and fixed up the address pool, the next step is to set scope options that you want to set out to clients such as router, that is default gateway, and DNS server addresses. You must configure the options you want set out before you activate the scope. If you don't, clients may register it in the scope without getting any options, rendering them virtually useless. Thus, configure the scope options along with the IP address and subnet mask that you configured earlier in this chapter. In the following sections, you will learn how to configure and assign scope options on a DHCP server. So I'm going to leave it here today for this video. If you like listening, please consider like, sharing, and subscribing. Thank you.